Welcome everyone. Welcome to the last session of our monthly meeting series, Another World is Possible, Feminist Answers to Big Questions. We're so grateful that you're all here today for this important and reflective discussion today. Today's big question is, what do we do next for systems change? We have interpretation in Spanish, English, and French. So please select the language you'd like to listen to the meeting in. You can go to the globe icon at the bottom right of your Zoom screen and select the interpretation channel you'd like to go to. Even if you'd like to listen to the interpretation in English, please do select the English channel. I will now pass the floor to our French interpreters to make the announcement in French.
Bonjour à toutes et tous. L'interprétation en français est disponible pour cette session. Pour y accéder, vous devez simplement cliquer sur le petit globe en bas à droite de votre écran et sélectionner la langue de votre choix. Et si vous nous suivez depuis un téléphone portable, cette option est accessible en cliquant sur les 3 petits points et sélectionner la langue. Voilà, merci.
Thank you. I will now pass the floor to our Spanish interpreters to make this announcement in Spanish.
Thank you, gracias. Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches. Hoy estaremos proveyendo interpretación en español. Vamos a poner las instrucciones en el chat. Si están conectando desde un computador y quieren escuchar en español, por favor hagan clic en el globo abajo que dice interpretación y elijan español. Si están conectando desde un teléfono o una tableta, por favor toquen los 3 punticos abajo a la derecha que dice más, eligen interpretación de idiomas, ahí escogen español y después arriba a mano derecha en el teléfono presionan finalizado. Si tienen algún problema con la interpretación, por favor déjenos saber y con gusto les apoyaremos. Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we begin, we'll run through some accountability and accessibility and logistics notes. So here's today's agenda. After the current logistic notes, the Secretariat will give an introduction and some background on this series, Another World is Possible. After that, the moderator will take over, and for the first half of the meeting, we'll listen to some feminist proposals and movement advice from WMD members. The second half of the meeting will be a radical reflection exercise and a discussion where we'll move to a Miro board. My colleagues, Shehnaz, Andrea, and I, as well, will be the accessibility and safety coordinators in the call. If you have any accessibility, safety, and connection concerns, please do write to us. I'd also like to note that this meeting is only open to WMD members as participants, but we will be recording the first hour of our meeting and we'll be sharing it on our YouTube and social media channels as a resource for everyone to access. The open discussion that we'll be having at the end will not be recorded. As always, discriminatory remarks, hate speech, denial of self-proclaimed identities, anti-rights discourse, and other forms of discrimination against folks and groups speaking in the meetings or those participating will not be tolerated. If any such incident occurs, the person will be removed from this platform after a warning. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to recognize all the feminists who could not be here today with us and are fighting all forms of oppression and for systems change. We honor the women human rights defenders who lost their lives in struggle against these systems of oppression. Without any further ado, I'll pass the floor to the Women's Major Group Secretariat colleagues of mine, Andrea and Shehnaz, to tell us more about the exciting background and objectives of this monthly meeting series, Another World is Possible, Feminist Answers to Big Questions. The floor is all yours, Shehnaz.
Thank you so much, Maitri. Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to be with you in this last session of another monthly meeting series. So how this monthly meeting series came about is actually from the frustration and the feeling of despair that we all sometimes feel with the intersecting and exacerbating crises we're living throughout the world. However, when going through them, when thinking about them, we have we also realize and know that feminists have actually been working on these big questions in the intersection of gender equality and women's human rights for decades now. So we wanted to present the feminist solutions and policy proposals already in place that has shown us that another world is possible if we can implement those and advocate for those together. So in the last 3 months, we have looked into economic justice and feminist answers to how we can transform our economic systems away from this extractive, exploitative capitalist structure. We've looked into how we can work with the environmental, how we can work back against the environmental crises throughout the world. And lastly, last month, we militarism, bodily autonomy, and policing of our lives and our bodies. So these all sound like very big questions that only the experts, and most of the time male experts, honestly, cis male experts seem to kind of go on record and talk to us about, but we've actually heard over the past 3 months that the amazing feminists who have come in and given us their real, just, fair solutions to going into this world, going into this feminist world that we have imagined. So now we are at the session where we hope to build the peace and the connections between those sessions. And for that, I can give the floor to Andrea to lead us through the next, last session. Thank you.
Thanks, Shanaz. So yeah, like Shanaz was saying, we had these past 3 sessions on how to transform our economic system, how do we sustain life and on our planet through these environmental and climate crisis. And our last session was on how we reach peace throughout the world. So we know that all these things are connected. We know the climate crisis is connected to militarism. We know that militarism is connected to our unjust global economic system. So we know all these things are connected. And we know that as movements, there's also the big question of like, well, how do we organize? How do we push forward these solutions? And we can have these internal discussions, but how do we really reflect on what it is that we're doing, how we are organizing, how we are advocating, at what levels, with what strategies. And that's what this session is for. It's kind of like, what do we do next for systems change? So that's what we're hoping today will be, a sort of wrap-up session that connects our knowledge of all of these systems of oppression and really asks ourselves how we reflect on how our fight is going and how we reflect on how we are mobilizing and what do we commit to, not just as people, but as organizations and more broadly as the women's major group. So that's what we're hoping to do today. And we also had mentioned in the past sessions that we hope to have an outcome of this series, as we do with all of our past monthly meeting series, so that it doesn't just stay in sort of this Zoom void, and that we have a tangible summary of everything that we've discussed. So in the past, we've done infographics, we've done graphic records, but for this series, because it has this sort of manifesto ring to it already, we're saying another world is possible. And guess what? Like, people have the solution. So we decided that maybe we could put out a sort of short blog that is sort of a manifesto about how another world is possible, and how Women's Major Group, what we commit to in order to achieve it. So also what we'll discuss in this session. So the idea is to present the proposals outlined by each of our speakers in this series. It'll be 2 or so pages, hopefully not too long, written blog style in an accessible language, including links to all the resources our members have shared in these calls, and explaining in just a few sentences. For example, in our last call, someone talked about feminist foreign policy and they volunteered to write a paragraph on it, for example. So just honing in on on these solutions and summarizing in a way that's accessible. People don't have to watch the entire recordings to understand what the solutions are, what our proposals are. And we are also hoping to weave in what we'll discuss in this call. So really weaving in at the end, after summarizing all the proposals from the last 3 sessions, also bringing in our reflections and commitments from this last session. And we are, of course, hoping that this can be, as all women's major group documents, a collaborative process and a collectively drafted process. So as Secretariat, will come up with an outline, and then some of the speakers have already volunteered to sort of flesh out and help draft their portions, the solutions that they've presented. But we're looking for members who would be interested in participating in this drafting process, or it can also be editing, or it can also have, like, if you have a creative idea for this, if you're like, oh, I can really imagine myself making a video reading this specific thing, or I can imagine myself like sharing a resource on like how to reach peace, or like I'm really passionate about climate justice and I think it would be really important that we share this specific art on it, then you can also do that. Just email us. We're hoping that this work will take place throughout the month of January, and especially probably the last 2 weeks of January, seeing as people will hopefully be off for the holidays and enjoying some rest time at the beginning of the year. But we're hoping this will come together in January. So we would touch base with you all again in the new year, but do leave your email in the chat or email us, Shanaz, Andrea, and Maitri, you have our emails. But yeah, just to leave us also with that in mind as an outcome of this series. But without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to our newly elected Latin America and the Caribbean organizing partner, Alessandra Nilo of Gestos Brazil, to moderate our meeting today. Thank you, Alessandra. The floor is yours to get us started by introducing today's meeting topic, our amazing speakers as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Andrea and colleagues. It's such pleasure to be here with you now, and particularly with this new role that I take, which is to mobilize our colleagues and feminists from Latin America and the Caribbean, and to create more connections with all of you in the globe. This is a particularly interesting process to have this series of these meetings, because we have seen a lot of sessions at the UN and among civil society in general. There are mainly focusing on diagnosis. And this is very innovative to show that we can move beyond the diagnosis. And in fact, that for decades, feminists has been on the top in terms of presenting solutions, because definitely if there is something that we learn is that we know how to solve these big questions in front of us. And of course, these are very complex moments, geopolitically speaking. We have seen a lot of setbacks in the past years. The situation ahead is not easy, and probably you have more setbacks. But at this point, it's very important that we continue to say that we have solutions, and that everything that we have been facing is also accompanied by solutions. They have many ways to solve that, and we need to push our governments further in order to implement those solutions. So part of the briefing that we have been sharing with colleagues is that feminists have refused and challenged this narrative for decades. So let's continue doing that, and let's continue doing that in a very collaborative and very, very nice way. And the idea, oh, I don't know why my video was not, I was not showing myself here. Okay, fix. But let's continue to do that in a very collaborative way, which is, you know, the main reason for our success is that we are not alone. We work all together. So it is my pleasure today to kind of moderate the session with support of our colleagues from the Secretariat. And the idea is to have 3 great feminists with us today. They will brought some quick fire interventions, 10 minutes each. And they are Deleon, Patricia Wattimena, Gina Cortés Valderrama. And they're super, super, super connected with our movements, and they are very active in proposing solutions through all the process within our women's major group. So let's begin with Deleon. Deleon, you are an activist with intersectional organizing experience across many, many movements, and not only across many movements, but also across different levels. Could you tell us a little bit more about the importance of working, strategizing across those movements? We have been discussing a lot the importance of not working in silos, and it's very important to hear your experience and how can we improve that way of working in this collaborative, cross-cutting movement way. Deleon, you have the floor. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Alessandra. Thank you to the Women Major Group Secretariat for the invitation to speak to the membership. It feels good to be back amongst friends. I used to coordinate the WMG network from 2015 when we still had the intergovernmental negotiations for the SDGs to 2020 following the first 5 years of the 2030 agenda implementation. As I think about my time with the WMG and the prompt about cross movements, I actually think of the amazing work and solidarity being built in the feminist movement in our Women Major Group network. When I was around, the network had thousands of feminist and women's rights organizations who I learned so much from. I'm sure it's only grown more since then. And due to the comprehensive nature of the 2030 agenda that we activists pushed for, I had the opportunity to advocate on multiple UN fora, from the high-level political forum to the Commission on Status of Women, to the COP on climate change and desertification, to the UN Environmental Assembly and statistics, and all the other boring UN meetings. But let me introduce myself first. My name is Deleon. I'm sending my most militant and warm greetings from Alameda. I live on occupied Ohlone land, or the Bay Area in California, in the #1 imperialist country in the US, in the world, the United States. I use they, them pronouns, and I immigrated from the Philippines at the age of 3 years old. And due to poverty caused by US imperialism and forced migration, the Philippine government's labor export policy continues to treat people as commodities, as the #1 export. Thousands continue to leave every day, about 6,000 people, and my family is just one of millions. So growing up in the United States as an immigrant, as a poor person, as a person of color, as a fat feminine person, I didn't have the tools to navigate the world. It was later when I got politicized in an after-school program that had to train youth to recognize systems of oppression and how to organize. And then in college, when I gained the analytical tools of feminism, queer studies, and ethnic studies, and organizing for the National Democratic Movement of the Philippines, did I feel empowered to weaponize my experience to imagine and organize for another world, a better world. So as a trans and gender non-conforming femme that carry all these intersectional identities, immigrant, poor, fat, Filipino, I bring up these identities to share how crucial it is to have an intersectional analysis. To build and to sustain cross movements, we first need an intersectional analysis. It's more important than ever to approach not just our personal lives with such a lens, but also our political work. Smashing patriarchy is climate justice. Queer and trans liberation is debt justice and reparations. Access to safe and legal abortions for all is a migrant justice issue. Anti-imperialism is ending militarism and vice versa. I do want to add here that intersectionality is important, but also deserves to be critically examined. A lot of my intersectional analysis is rooted in class analysis. It never escapes me that every day is a class warfare on the poor and the oppressed. We are seeing intersectionality popularized by liberals and sadly white women whose gender doesn't excuse them from their class privilege and white supremacy that perpetuate violence. Or we see in the LGBTQ movement a prioritization of gay marriage while ignoring the deaths of Black and brown trans women, or that queers in Palestine still suffer from occupation while Tel Aviv celebrates Pride. In 2014, I woke up to this horrible news of the murder of Jennifer Laude. I never knew her, but felt an understanding of who she is. She was a Filipina trans woman who lived and worked as a sex worker near the US military base in the Philippines, a city known as Olongapo. One night, she was on a date with Joseph Scott Pemberton, a Lance Corporal of the United States Marine Corps. When he found out she was trans, he dragged her to the bathroom, submerged her into the toilet, drowning Jennifer. Pemberton admitted assaulting Laude and deployed a trans panic attack in his 2015 trial. In 2020, then Philippine President and known misogynist Rodrigo Duterte pardoned Pemberton. I bring up this story because it was a grave injustice and continues to fuel my work with trans rights, feminism, climate justice, and human rights. I feel a deep anger and think about my own life and my other trans sisters and non-binary siblings. US imperialism continues to rampage through our homelands, not just in the rape and killing of girls, women, and trans people, but the big warships damage our reefs that house and incubate so much of the marine life and biodiversity. Rockets and emissions continue to pollute our airs. The bombs displace the indigenous, such as the Lumad in the south. The deforestation and mining are executed by foreign multinational corporations that extract resources from our rich land that never trickles down to the poor. Instead, the robbing of raw resources continues to profit the rich to be even richer, all while these corporate businesses are protected by military posts to quell resistance. Finally, the killing of human rights and environmental defenders, workers, women, youth, farmers, indigenous people, queers who have spoken against climate change and imperialism. These systems of oppression, be it patriarchy, misogyny, transphobia, extractivism, war, and imperialism, have really operated together to impact the people. Then President Rodrigo Duterte and the continuation of the dictator's son, Bongbong Marcos, as the new Philippine president, continues to appease US imperialism, mining and privatization of indigenous land, and assaults on women and trans people. Their policies continue to kill people like Jennifer Laude, while globally these macho fascist leaders kill countless millions all over the world. So similar to how these evils have operated together, so must our movements. Besides demonstrating how our issues are so interconnected, it's also so imperative to link arms across movements because we don't have as many resources as the systems of oppression do. We operate within a system of dignity and human rights, a care economy, deep love for the people and the planet. When I take care of my elderly sick mom, I'm reminded of the unrecognized care work upheld by so many women and femmes and immigrants. We have to care for one another because capitalism teaches us that people are disposable. If we are to come together to win and save our planet, solidarity is key and so needed more than ever. So I really want to challenge us as feminists and activists when we come across the opportunity to engage in work that is outside our scope of activism. How do we show up for other movements? How do we find connections and build a mass movement? How do we find, what does a better dignified, feminist, queer, trans, climate just, sustainable, unionized, non-carceral future look like? When there's an eviction happening, how can we show up for tenants who are people that need adequate housing? When there's a union busting, how can we show up for workers who need income to survive? When there's a deportation, How can we show up for migrants who face violence back home? When there's stealing of ancestral domain, how can we show up for Indigenous people who care for our collective land? When there's another report of a murdered trans woman or a non-binary comrade, how do we show up to demonstrate that we are tired of depictions of our death? Instead, can you uplift my resistance to show that women and trans people also fight back? In 2016, I remember visiting Standing Rock, where Native youth and Indigenous people from all over the US came together to stop the construction of an energy pipeline. It was such a powerful movement as we saw solidarity from allies such as the Black Lives Matter and international movements like the Indigenous Maori from New Zealand presenting a sacred haka dance. These are movements we need to sustain. We need to move away from moments and into movements. And it's happening all around us, right? We're seeing more unions come up in America. We're seeing the Iranian people's movements fighting against the treatment of women and the religious extremism. And we see Ukrainian and Russian women coming together calling for peace. And so I wanted to conclude by reading a quote from Audre Lorde. She said, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. Our struggles are particular, but we are not alone. We are not perfect, but we are stronger and wiser than some of our errors." And then finally, just to wake up everyone, because I know it's really early for me here in California, it's around 7:30. I wanted to end in a chant. And I know we all are familiar with this chant because I still follow the women's major group and see it a lot. But it's funny because when we first used to do this chant in women's major group, we just used to say, what do we want? Gender justice, when do we want it now? But because I used to organize in New York, which I learned more from radical comrades there, they added the part, what do we do, shut it down? And I'm so happy that women's major group continues to use it, especially in the climate negotiations. So I'll lead the chat, and if folks can go unmute on the mic, it'll be fun to chat together. So I say, what do we want? You say gender justice. And then I say, when do we want it? You say now. And then I say, if we don't get it, you say, shut it down. Got it? Okay. What do we want?
Gender justice.
When do we want it?
Now.
If we don't get it,
Shut it down.
Shut it down.
if we don't get it,
Shut
Shut
it
it
down.
down.
if
It
we
down.
don't get it, shut
Shut
it
it
down.
Shut it down.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. It's so good to see everyone again.
Dear Leon, thank you so much for your sharing your, not only your experience, but your deep feelings about what we are discussing here today. It's super important that you are reminding us that all these conversations about multi-sectorial, intersectional work only works if it's based on strong and rights-based foundations among ourselves, first and foremost among ourselves. What is the point of us asking for solidarity and support from all other groups, governments, decision makers, etc., if we are not among us doing the same? I think we should lead by example. And so thank you very much for sharing, your ideas and your feelings on that. Thank you. Super. And with that very inspirational first talk, let's move to Patricia Wattimena. And with Patricia, we'd like to know more now that we have this very important introduction from Leon. What is the importance of this activism that can be also based on the grassroots needs and on the groundwork? Because usually many groups comes to global spaces, etc., without having a strong experience on the field, but assuming things around or about the field. But it's so interesting when we see this connection, when you see that the international level requires the local level, and the local levels also can influence the international arena, and vice versa. Can you share a little bit more about your experience, and please introduce more yourself? Welcome.
Thank you so much, Alessandra, and everyone. And I understand that I have 10 minutes. I'm trying to time myself here. I'm Patricia, as Alessandra has mentioned, and I'm with the Climate Justice Program of Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, calling from Chiang Mai, Thailand. Now it's 10:30 here. So it's a little quiet right here at home because my partner, my daughter, they're already sleeping. But also at the same time, it has been really, really fantastic to hear what Leon was sharing as a kickoff of the conversation that we are having. And I am very, very honored to be part of this space, to be invited to this space with a lot of amazing feminists and political activists, awesome people, awesome queers, to share stories, experiences, and thoughts. You know, responding to what Alessandra was asking, it is a big question indeed, because aside from so many other technical questions or technical matters that we are dealing so many times at the regional and international level, people call them big questions. But for me, one of the most important big questions as we are doing our work is how we are keep on being grounded on the grassroots women's realities, on the experiences on the ground. I think we all can agree that the very core of feminism, of our political activism, is being grounded in the grassroots women's needs and lived realities. And indeed, it is very critical, especially in our ongoing common struggles, that is not getting easier. Be it to dismantle patriarchy, be it to demand accountabilities from the states, from the corporations, or any other actors that violate our human rights. I think especially in our regional and global work, as we always say that we demand justice, we demand gender justice, we demand climate justice, justice for the peoples. And in doing so, we who engage at regional and global levels, many of us are here doing the work, I feel that really we must be able to ensure that voices from the ground, voices of those who are oppressed and suffering due to political, health, climate, and other crises on a daily basis, their voices must be reflected in many spaces, in many regional global spaces. As APWLD, and because the questions are also around there, and with APWLD, and as APWLD in my current role at the moment, which is so similar, as I said, with many of us here, I see a critical role, especially in engaging with regional and global spaces. And it was touched upon by Leon in their presentation before around the detachment of so many elements, so many actors also. And then we really ask ourselves, why do we have to be grounded in women's experiences and realities? Because the reality of the communities is not in the conference rooms in Geneva or in New York or in Egypt, as we just concluded COP27. And in so many cases, as we have been witnessing, those conference rooms are often blind to the reality on the ground. We often see those global and regional meetings, conferences, full of decision makers turning into talk shows or business-dominated spaces, rather than places to really talk about radical transformation to protect and advance our human rights, to imagine more radical futures for our planet. And in that context, I believe that collective struggle, our collective struggles, will be stronger and can bring about change if we are able to create space for women in all their diversity to speak for themselves, taking into account their specific contexts and challenges, strengthening our intersectional approach and analysis, strengthening our solidarity to challenge the systemic and structural barrier, challenge the power structure rooted in colonialism and in historical inequalities between men and women, between and within countries, between the global north and the global south. It is never enough to keep on re-emphasizing these factors as important drivers in our struggles. For me, remaining grounded also means that we remain accountable. And for me, it is very important that we keep on remain accountable. We must remain accountable to ourselves, to our values and actions, to our communities and constituencies, to the communities we are working with, and to so many women who put their hope and trust in us to march together with them in our collective struggles. In my experience, as we work at the regional and international levels, dealing with negotiations after negotiations, sometimes it is very, very difficult for us to see tangible change. But for me personally, after going back and then seeing the women and the communities, listening to their stories, witnessing their tenacity and determination to organize, mobilize, and fight back, there I see a tangible change. Every time I wonder, why am I here and what am I in this very collective global movement? Aside from my lived realities, I'm learning also a lot, not only from my own indigenous community, but also from the work that APWLD is doing, the organization that I am with right now. But I want to clarify that I am not limited only to APWLD because my mandate is with the community back home. And APWLD for me is a tool, is a space where I could also contribute to the larger movements. So in APWLD, we use this tool that maybe some of us have heard, that is the feminist participatory action research, to amplify stories and experiences of women, because some women, as has been acknowledged earlier in the event, in this conversation, that they cannot be here because of so many systemic challenges or even political repressions they're facing. APWLD has been doing FPAR for such a long time, bringing voices from different corners in Asia and the Pacific. But what is different of the FPAR, what is different with this FPAR is it is never been owned, it is not and will never be owned by APWLD alone, or any other institutions or any other individuals. FPAR, as it is right now, is a common property and common knowledge of so many different women groups crossed paths in the FPAR journey since day one, more than a decade ago. And APWLD is part of it. It can never be privatized no matter what. And that is the beauty and difference of FPAR as a tool to keep our work grounded in the needs and changing contexts and challenges facing women and their communities on the ground. As we are approaching at the end of this year, very, very interesting year indeed, as some of us are saying that we are recovering from the pandemic, the reality shows in the global South Asia and the Pacific, we do not talk yet even about recovering. We are still there. And for me, the collective reflection is always important, and I'm so grateful that this space is organized by the Women's Major Group. This is a truly, truly important space. For me, it is like a time to recharge rather than an obligation. To close this, let me share that as opposed to the root causes of women's oppression that are rooted in globalization, fundamentalisms, militarism, and patriarchy, the power of our collective movements is rooted in the voices of the communities. For me, being grounded is not an option. It is a must, and it is a mandate that we are trusted with, and we need to be true to that mandate. It is the essential of our everyday work as feminists, political activists, especially as we work at a regional and global level. Thank you so much, Alessandra, for your flexibility.
Oh, Patricia, we thank you for reminding us a lot of things that usually so easy to forget when we are working at the global level. And because we are talking also about inclusion, I will continue in Spanish. So you have 30 seconds to turn on your chat for translation. Entonces, es muy bueno.
Very well. So it's incredible that you have brought to us that reflection about the reality, right? And how can we, that we are at the community level, right? Not only do we need to think about public policy, but also responding to crises on the day-to-day, all of those crises that affect us daily, women's rights. Another point that I think that it's quite interesting is to create a connection with the session that's coming up. It's to think also how many times in those rooms where decisions are being made, people who make those decisions are so far away from reality. It is so sad to know that after so many years, we have so many agreements that have been done that we're still repeating them. We're changing them, the language a little bit here, a little bit there, but we are not able to achieve agreement sometimes. Now, finally, I think that it's quite courageous to have that perspective of always not just what Leon has brought forward having to do with interdisciplinary relationships, but also relationships based among one another, and also talk about accountability, right? We need to bring the conversation about accountability. I think it's quite important to think about accountability. Now, given that we are making more rich, right? That process of alliance building, this is fundamental. This is of the utmost importance so that we are able to discuss structural causes, the roots of the inequality and violence that
not less important presenter today, who is Gina Cortés Valderrama. And Gina, I think that after listening to Leon and Patricia, it's also very interesting to talk a little bit more about how our local activisms can also be inspired and benefited by the global conversations and the global debates and demands about how to change the systems also at global level. We are very happy to hear you. You just are coming out from COPE space, and I think it's perfect to hear you to try to wrap up a little bit this interrelation between the local and the global levels and the vice versa. Welcome, and you have the floor. 10 minutes, please.
Muchas gracias. Intentaré mantenerme.
Thank you so much. I will try to stay within the 10 minutes. I am going to speak in Spanish because I feel more comfortable speaking in Spanish, and also because I would like to begin to to begin with writing, a reflection that actually came up for me after one of the actions that we had in COP, an episode that really impacted my space in COP in a way that was very emotional, in a way that was also very mental and very political in a sense. And my way to process all of these things is writing. I am not a poet. I didn't study literature or anything like that, so it's not a perfect text, but at least it's a reflection that I would like to share. And it goes like this. I can feel your anger. I can feel the warmth of your heartbeat. I can feel through your eyes the cry of that collective trauma agitated by the desire to be heard, to be healed. It's in your body, it's in mine. The scar of cycles of oppression, the scar of an endless war. It's on your skin, it's on mine. The history of a colonial past, the present of that same structural ideology that remains unexpired. It is not with me that you must clash against. It's with the opulence of a capitalism that seeks to enrich itself, a perverse game of accumulation and aggression that seeks to separate us. They may have drawn imaginary borders to divide us. They may have created color palettes to segregate us. They may push us behind bars to silence us, but they can never, ever break the collective power of our voices. It's in your voice, it's in mine. The power of our souls entwined in an embrace. The power runs through my body when I see you sing, leaving fear behind. When I feel you vibrate, strong and determined as our march. It is from our autonomy that we will trace the path towards the revolution of that utopian desire that materializes from our demands to a historical depth. It's from our ancestral feeling that we understand and approach each other in resistance, in struggle, or in the disobedience itself, with determination towards a post-capitalist reality in which your cry, together with mine, are translated into action. We will rise like the water. We will stand strong as the mountains. Our voices will be lifted by the wind, and our collective power will burn as brightly as fire. We are not defeated, and we will never be defeated. These were parts of a reflection that, as I was saying, came up after the march that we had in COP in the first week, in a march that where there was a lot of energy, there was a lot of people that we were not expecting to have there, but also behind the scenes, behind the interventions and behind the chants, there were a lot of things that were happening at the same time. And behind the scenes, you could feel that cry from each person who wanted to lift up their voices, who wanted to bring the demands of their country, of their own region, of their own community. There were people who wanted to be recognized, who wanted to be listened to, who maybe didn't feel represented in the declarations or the people who were doing the interventions, even though there were people from the region who were speaking. And I had an encounter with someone behind the scenes, behind at that moment where the interventions were being given. And it was at that moment of anger with that person. That person had expressed feeling anger, but it was in that moment where we looked at each other in the eye, and between tears, I was able to understand that we shared the same feeling and that we shared the same cry. understanding at that moment that it is not our movements, that our movements are not one region against another, or a country against another, or one struggle or struggle between one affected community against another. It's to start from the understanding that our experiences are not the same, no, but that they spring from the same colonial root that is still present in our economic structures that govern us, that are still very present in those negotiation rooms from these conferences, at least the climate conference, where the narrative of extraction, of accumulation, of individual enrichment is promoted. And we also see this not just in the topic of climate, but also we see it when it comes to prioritizing militarization, war, no? We also see it during the pandemic regarding the decisions that we're making at a government level that just left an apartheid on the issue of vaccines. And we see it in those decisions that are being taken currently that, as Pat was saying so well, places like the COP have turned into a capitalist fair co-opted by those individual interests, where those false solutions and risky solutions that are also very costly are there in those transformative models that communities and movements have already developed as an alternative way to development. And we have also seen how in many regions, such as it is the case of Latin America, we see it in Iran, we see it in China, how those protests that happen, they happen not just as a consequence of the pandemic or a tax reform, but they go even more in depth and they manifest against those relationships of power that entrapped the community in cycles of inequality, of poverty, of structural racism, of mistrust, division, and fear. Those inequalities and those forms of oppression that are intertwined and respond to the same colonial history that has affected us ever since, from the Guajira in Colombia to the deepest ends of the Philippines, Indonesia, and going across the whole world. And it is in this global view, understanding beyond and more in depth all these structural consequences from all of the multiple crises, that we're able to take a step forward, that we're able to understand how colonialism, for example, and I focus on this, has configured those behaviors, those norms, those perceptions, how that ideology, that colonialism ideology, is still present in our notion of development, in that knowledge of relating to one another, establishing a monocultural way of domination before a geographical landscape that is so diverse and so rich, such as all of our lands are. It's reflecting on this that we began to asking ourselves to promote and to propose those alternative models for a systemic change in health, in energy, in education, to move towards that global perspective where we move together so that there's financing that guarantees that there are structures of public services and not individual solutions such as electric cars or all of those scooters that just change one exploitative system from carbon to another one that is called lithium, without really rethinking or restructuring what is it that as a collective we need right now from a local perspective, understanding how all of these demands unite us, maybe from different fronts, because the struggles are many, but how All these struggles are part of a structural net structured by the same capitalism itself. The COP that happened in Egypt left us much more clarity on this, on that urgency of thinking outside of the box to think about post-capitalist presents and futures in which we imagine ourselves living in truth, right? Because these spaces are being more co-opted every time. How do we get out of the technicisms of these political spaces to what we truly are looking for and what we're really, what our movements are really promoting? To ask ourselves from that global perspective, how we can work together and be more effective in shaking up those fears where power is concentrated in the richest 1% who must pass the bill, in the taxation of those polluting industries, in the prevailing status quo from an Eurocentric perspective, because it is that Eurocentric perspective that doesn't know any other paradigms. It doesn't know the good way of living. It doesn't know Ubuntu. It doesn't know many other practices, so many different models that are there and exist from our territories. Connecting through conversation in our regions, South-South conversation, solidarity between different co-created campaigns that are amplified from the different regions. And that's something that also after COP, because in particular after COP, there's always a moment of reflection and digestion that is very hard. And there is one reflection that I also had, which was how at this moment where we are normalizing the speed, the rush to produce, we are setting aside, we're leaving behind our own well-being. And not just from the industrial production, but also I'm talking about my own case, my individual Gina, from my starting point, where I also have entered in the same cycle, forgetting to listen to my body when it tells me, are you okay? Are you unwell? Because I am in that same cycle of rushing and rushing and rushing, seeking justice. And we forget about what our body says, about the headache, about the tension in our jaw, about the digestion that is not working. Such a radical act in these times, such as self-care itself, is incredible that that is a radical act at this moment. And in particular, in Egypt, I can also say that it wasn't easy to mobilize people. It wasn't easy to mobilize activists because there was a feeling of fear based on discrimination, on surveillance, on intimidation. So under these circumstances, it was not easy to bring people, bring them together to lift up their voices freely. However, we connected before the same voice. We connected because we understand and we are guided by something that is much deeper than a technicism or an article in a piece of paper. We are understanding with the empathy of our experiences that it is from our unity that we can rise together. And I wanted to share the text from the beginning, that reflection that I shared, because that reminded me once again that it is possible to connect, that it is possible to get out of the anger, the shock, the confrontation, when we look at each other in the eye and we understand that we are under that same vision, under that same heart, understanding that climate action goes beyond an institutional agenda. This is a matter of a Latin reality of those people who have the impacts of climate change at their doorsteps, that they can feel it breathing in their neck. And it is understanding that collectivity is primacy and our community is first. So this is a calling to begin to work and always remembering the collective power, mobilizing in a collective way, but also, and something that I'm trying to remind myself of is let's take care of each other together. And that way we'll be able to walk stronger from a place of empathy, from love, and being stronger and demanding solidarity in our movements, but historical accountability before those contaminants. Thank you so much.
Super, Gina. Super.
Incredible, Gina. Thank you so much, Gina. Truly, I am so thankful. Very profound, deep reflection.
About this collective trauma that we have about not being heard, about the perversity that is, marking our bodies, also for reminding us about the importance of autonomy to respond to that interlinked and crisis, historical debts that we have facing. Also for bringing up the issue of structural racism that is so important to all of us to stimulate to this thought about the emergency of the issues that we need to address, but at the same time the respect that we need always to pay to our bodies, to our own lives, so we can work better, we can build better movements. And finally also for reminding us that we are all connected, all together on for the same causes and in the fight for better public systems to all of us, because are not individual responses. They are, and they must be collective responses. So thank you very much. It was, the three speakers were super inspiring, and I hope you are feeling the same, because now we need to get ready to move to our exercise. And